So I've been living in Tokyo, Japan, managing my own business in this country for over 6 years. And even though many of us have our preconceptions and our ideas of how we think life is in Japan, the reality is that things have changed a lot in that time. We've survived a global crisis, multiple prime ministers, and even what you could consider to be a very significant financial crisis in the country. But despite all those challenges and obstacles, I've also noticed that many things have also changed for the better. And so today I would like to share with you what some of those things actually are. So you could say we'll be keeping a positive spin on things today, and since I've been living here for 6 years, then why not make it 6 good changes that Japan has undergone over the past few years. And the first thing I would like to talk about, certainly something that has impacted my life, is the potential and support for startups and entrepreneurship in Japan. Now, as I've said in some of my previous videos, the government currently has multiple organizations and campaigns and even foundations that give support and even grants to entrepreneurs and foreign entrepreneurs who are coming to Japan to create their own businesses. Now, I've also said before that I'm in no way affiliated or associated with this. In fact, I'm not receiving any form of financial support from the government, but I think it's a very good sign of where they're aiming to take things in the near future. They're trying to bring in tons of new people, new entrepreneurs to come and revitalize and sort of re-energize and refresh the market in the country. And so if you've been thinking about bringing your business into Japan or even coming into Japan to create your own business, maybe now might be a good time to do so. Now, as a side note, I'm currently also working on another video which should be coming anytime soon, talking about everything you need to know about the startup visa. Now, this could also be a very convenient and efficient way for you to come into the country, particularly if we compare it with, for example, the business manager visa. Because when you apply for your startup visa, you don't need to have employees or an office in the country or even a big capital or any of those other requirements that could be difficult to acquire. The startup visa is basically made for you to be able to come into the country and get everything set up, get everything in order to be able to start your business. So if that's something that interests you and you'd like to learn more, then make sure you don't miss that video. Now, as you might know, in this channel we often talk about things related to this topic, particularly life as an entrepreneur in Japan. So if that's something you'd like to learn more about, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, and if there's anything in particular that you'd like to know, then you're more than welcome to let me know in the comments as well. And so the next thing I would like to talk about now is, surprisingly, the improvements to their work-life balance. Because yes, while it's true that Japan's work culture is slowly evolving over time, there's no denying that there have been some significant changes over the past few years. In fact, as of the last handful of years, it's become more and more acceptable for new fathers to go on paternity leave as well. Even though, as you could imagine, for cultural reasons or maybe even social pressures, many new fathers actually decide not to take it. And this, well, you could argue it's because many companies still tend to be a little bit old-fashioned in that regard. But regardless, the government has launched multiple initiatives to incentivize and promote less overtime and more flexible working hours, and even things like remote work, which here in Japan we call telework, continue to be implemented in more and more companies all over the country since the pandemic. And so clearly all these things are aiming towards being able to give people a healthier balance between their work life and their personal life. And even like I've said in other videos as well, many companies have also started implementing things like hobby groups or clubs where people can gather and get together to enjoy other non-work related activities. So even though, yes, Japanese work culture might be far from perfect, there are certain changes that are being done in the right direction towards improving it. And now the next thing I would like to talk about is actually the advancements in public transportation. Now, Japan is already quite famous for having an impeccable public transportation system. It's always punctual, it's always extremely clean, and it always works perfectly. But let me tell you, things are about to go to a whole other level. Because in 2026, Japan will be adding another train to their line of bullet trains. And this maglev train is going to be able to take you from Tokyo to Nagoya at 505 kilometers per hour. Which means that what could have taken you before an hour and a half of your day now will be taking you less than 45 minutes. And so inevitably all these big changes are going to be bringing the entire country a lot closer together. And so you could eventually go to Kyoto for lunch and be back in Tokyo before resuming your work, or you could go spend the morning in Osaka and then come back before your lunch break. But other than that, there have also been many other measures in terms of security and efficiency that have come into place over the last few years. Like, for example, most stations, at least in Tokyo, have installed security gates at the edge of the platform to avoid unfortunate accidents, if you know what I mean. And there are also a few stations around the city that have installed these new biometric gates, which means you can just go through into the station, ride your train without needing to touch anything or even taking out your Suica card to scan it on the machines. And more you're starting to see things like solar-powered train stations or even buses and trains that run exclusively on hydrogen fuel. So all these things, even though once again might not be as advanced as other places around the world, you can see that there are efforts being made in the right direction towards improving things. And speaking about improving things, I think one of the things that could impact all of us the most, and I think likely one of the only good things to come from the pandemic, is that Japan has finally transitioned into being basically a cashless society. Now, for many years, Japan has been basically exclusively a cash-based society, which meant that if you didn't have any cash in your pocket, you could basically do nothing in the city. But I'm glad to say that I don't remember really when the last time was that I had to go to the bank or to the ATM to withdraw any cash. I basically don't use any cash anymore because since the pandemic, they really made the effort to very quickly transition into cashless. Everything is now just basically contact free. You can pay either with your smartwatch, with your phone, Quick Pay, Apple Pay, and all these things. And that really has made things a lot easier. Now, obviously, I'm talking mostly about the main cities. If you go out into more rural areas of the country, chances are you're still going to find lots of places that require cash. And even still here in Tokyo, you could find smaller shops or smaller restaurants that still don't accept credit cards and do everything by cash. But these have become really, truly the vast minority of cases. So I guess I'm happy to say that Japan has finally made that very important transition into the modern era when it comes to the payment systems. And speaking of modern era, one more thing that I have noticed that has changed in Japan over the past few years is their acceptance towards foreign cultures. Now, as many of you might know, Japan throughout their entire history has had a reputation for being not necessarily very open towards other cultures. After all, their borders were basically completely closed for over 200 years, shielding them entirely from the outside world. But I would have to say that recently, as of the last handful of years, this has also changed. If you compare it with, for example, just 10 years ago, where the entire foreign population of Japan was only 1.6%, or 20 years ago when it was 0.4%, now that number has basically doubled, reaching almost 3% of the population. Now, of course, if you take into account that Japan has also a very big population of almost over 136 million people, that number still continues to be very small. But well, from my personal experience, I can say that I've never had any major difficulties when it comes to being a foreigner, and even the difficulties I have had, I would argue that many of them have been because of my lack of understanding. Not understanding how to fill in a document properly, or maybe not knowing what to bring in order to do the transaction successfully, or even just not knowing how to communicate in the right way. Other than that, I have to say that the vast majority of the time, everyone has been absolutely welcoming and charming when it comes to interacting with a foreigner like myself. So yes, even though Japan might not be the most multicultural country on the planet, you can still see that there are certain efforts being made, whether by regular people like you and me or certain government institutions, to push it in the right direction, slowly over time. Because certain sources estimate that by 2040, as much as 10% of the population could be comprised of foreigners. And now the next point I'd like to talk about is their focus on digital transformation. This, I think, could also be a side effect from the pandemic. So lately, the country as a whole has finally started to embrace the digital age. And with that, many companies have also started turning all their operations into the digital world, if you will. Even as soon as 6 years ago, most administrative processes were still being done by hand. You still had to fill in all your paperwork by hand in the office, or take it back home, fill it in at home, sign it or stamp it with your ink, and then bring it back to the office. And if there was any mistake, then you would have to start the whole process all over again. But I'm glad to say, slowly but surely, all those days are slowly behind us. Because lately, with all this push for digital innovation and transformation, many things like renewing your residence documents, or even your health checkups, healthcare insurance, and even doctor's appointments, and many other things can be done online, finally, or even just very quickly in your smartphone. Of course, this doesn't apply to everything. There are some things that will still require that you do them by hand, and some of the things are taking a little bit longer than I'd like them to, like for example online banking, which in many places is still not up to par. But despite all that, I think many things slowly but surely are moving towards the right direction. So as you can see, Japan might be very futuristic in some aspects, but could be a little bit behind in others. And as I've noticed over my time living in this country, certain cultural trends, if you will, tend to take a little bit longer to reach Japan. So if you're able to see that as an advantage, that could also give you kind of a future vision. You can see by seeing what's happening in other parts of the world, what's going to arrive here in Japan in 2, 3, 4, or maybe 5 years time. And so if you're able to take advantage of that, you can use it to push through and move forward in your business. Now, if you'd like to learn more about life in Japan as an entrepreneur, make sure you go watch this video right here. In the meantime, take care, and I'll see you next time.